Grant leaned closely and murmured these truthful words to Lee at Appomattox, April 9, 1865, the modest village of Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. A Sunday morning so hushed you could almost hear the dogwood blossoms unfolding. Two men who had spent 4 years doing all they could to destroy each other now sat in the same simple parlor, no more than 10 feet apart. One wore the blue of triumph, the other still wore the gray of a cause that had only just breathed its last, Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee. Their handshake that day brought an end to the Civil War in the Eastern Theater. But something else took place in that room, something nearly no one overheard. 5 words, a whisper so soft it hardly stirred the air. 5 words that Grant spoke only to Lee, quietly enough that the aides and officers standing close by caught nothing but the movement of lips. Those 5 words have haunted every serious student of the surrender ever since. What exactly did he say? And why did both men want the moment preserved solely between them? Before we get into it, hit that like button and subscribe to join our growing community. To understand the significance of that whisper, you have to appreciate how far each man had come to reach that parlor. The war had started in 1861 with fanfare and illusions. Southern boys marched off singing Dixie, confident they would defeat the Yankees in a summer. Northern recruits promised they would be home by Christmas. 4 years later, neither side sang any more. More than 620,000 men were dead or missing. Whole towns had no men between 16 and 60. The South was devastated, farms burned, railroads twisted into scrap, currency worthless. The North possessed money and factories and endless recruits, but the butcher's bill was so high that Lincoln himself wondered whether the people would endure another year of it. Robert E. Lee had become something close to a living legend. He had never wanted to fight the Union. When Virginia seceded, he wrote to his sister that he considered the whole affair madness. Yet when Lincoln offered him command of the Federal Army, he replied that he could not raise his hand against his own people. So he went south. What followed was a series of victories that still take your breath away. 2nd Manassas, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville. Gettysburg might have broken him, but even after that disaster, he kept the Army of Northern Virginia in the field, bleeding but never quite shattered. His soldiers revered him. They called him Mars Robert. They followed him barefoot through snow and mud because they believed he would somehow manage one more miracle. Ulysses Grant was the opposite in nearly every way. Short, rumpled, perpetually chewing on the stub of a cigar. He had washed out of the pre-war army under a cloud of drink. He failed at farming, failed at real estate, ended up working in his father's leather goods store in Galena, Illinois, measuring out harness leather for a living. When Fort Sumter fell, he re-entered the Army as a clerk. Within 3 years, he was lieutenant general, commander of all Union armies. The newspapers called him a butcher because of the casualties at Cold Harbor and the Wilderness. Lincoln saw something different. "That man fights," he said. And he did. Grant never retreated for long. He hammered Lee from the Rapidan to the James month after month, refusing to let the Confederates breathe. By the spring of 1865, Lee's army was starving. Petersburg had been under siege for 9 months. Richmond was falling. Lee tried one final breakout. It failed. On April 9th, he sent a courier through the lines bearing a white flag. They met at the home of Wilmer McLean. The irony was nearly too perfect. McLean had moved his family to Appomattox to escape the war after a cannonball crashed through his parlor in Manassas 4 years earlier. Now the war had followed him home to end in that very same room. Grant arrived first, dressed as if he had just come off the march, private's blouse smeared with mud, boots caked, no sword, no braid. Lee entered a few minutes later, immaculate in his finest dress, gray, red sash, dress sword with gold hilt hanging at his side. The contrast could not have been sharper, yet there was no gloating. Grant shook hands. They sat. For a few minutes they talked about the old days in Mexico, about the campaign against Santa Anna when both men were young lieutenants, and the greatest worries were fever and poor rations. Then they got down to business. The terms Grant wrote out were generous. The Confederate soldiers would stack arms, turn over artillery and public property, sign paroles promising not to take up arms again against the United States. After that, they could go home. Officers could keep their sidearms and their personal horses. No one would be prosecuted for treason as long as they honored the parole. Lee read the draft. He asked only one change. Most of his men owned their own horses and mules. Could they keep those too? Grant said yes without hesitation. "They will need them for the spring plowing," he told Lee. The document was copied. Lee signed. Grant signed. The surrender was complete. But the moment most people remember, the moment preserved in 100 paintings and bronze statues, was not the signing. It was what happened right afterward. As the aide stepped forward to collect the papers, Grant leaned slightly toward Lee. His voice dropped so low that only the man across the table could hear. 5 words. Lee listened. His face did not change much. Those who were there said he gave the smallest nod, the barest tightening of the mouth. Then he stood. Grant stood. They shook hands again. Lee left the house, mounted Traveler, and rode back through the lines of his men, who lined the road in silence, some weeping, some reaching to touch his stirrup, as he passed. So, what were the 5 words? Historians have debated it for more than a century and a half. Eyewitness accounts are maddeningly vague. Colonel E. Lee S. Parker, Grant's military secretary, wrote that Grant spoke privately to Lee but did not repeat the words. Colonel Charles Marshall, Lee's aide, said only that something was said in a low tone. One of Grant's staff officers later claimed he caught the phrase, "Let us have peace," but that is 6 words and sounds too polished, too much like a statesman's line. Others have suggested variations on "go home in peace" or "take your men home." Still others believe the words were intensely personal. One of the more intriguing possibilities comes from a letter written years later by a Confederate officer who stood near the door. He claimed he heard Grant say, very quietly, "I remember Mexico." If true, those 5 words would carry layers of meaning. Both men had served together in the Mexican War. They had shared campfires, endured the same mud and dysentery, watched the same young men die on the road to Mexico City. Grant was reminding Lee that they had once been comrades, that the hatred of the last 4 years had not erased an older bond. In that single sentence he was saying, "This is not personal. We were soldiers before we were enemies. Now the fighting is over. Go home." Another theory points to something simpler and more human. Grant knew Lee's army was on the edge of starvation. Thousands of Confederates had already deserted simply to find food for their families. Grant had seen the gaunt faces himself when the prisoners came in. Some accounts suggest the whisper was, "Feed your men tonight." 5 words that would allow Lee to tell his soldiers the Union supply wagons were already moving forward with rations for the army. Practical, immediate, merciful. Whatever the exact phrase, the effect was unmistakable. Lee did not break down in that parlor. He held himself together with the iron composure that had carried him through Gettysburg and the Wilderness. But when he rode out and saw his men waiting, something gave way. Witnesses said his eyes were wet. He spoke to them briefly. "I have done the best I could for you," he told them. "My heart is too full to say more." Then he rode away. Grant never talked about the whisper in public. In his memoirs, he describes the meeting in detail, the terms, the conversation about Mexico, the moment Lee asked about the horses. But he leaves out the private exchange entirely. Perhaps he thought it too small to matter. Perhaps he knew it would be twisted by people looking for propaganda on either side. Or perhaps it was simply a moment he wanted to keep for himself and the man who had fought him so hard and so honorably. In the end, those 5 words matter because they remind us that even in the middle of history's greatest hinge points, human beings still speak to each other as human beings, not as symbols, not as generals, just 2 tired men who had seen too much death and wanted the killing to stop. Whatever Grant whispered, Lee carried it away with him. And in some way the rest of us still carry it too. A reminder that reconciliation can begin with something as small and as powerful as 5 quiet words spoken when no one else was meant to hear.